Put the gun down, Adrian, or you lose the last piece of yourself you still have. The words didn't come from her lips that night, but I heard them anyway, echoing louder than the city beneath my feet, louder than the deals, the money, the silence I had built my life around. Because the truth is I didn't lose myself in a single moment. I lost myself slowly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but a man who could stand in a room full of power and feel absolutely nothing. And that's where my story really begins. Not with the power, not with the empire, but with the emptiness that came after it. The kind that settles into your chest like cold air you can't breathe out. The kind that makes a penthouse overlooking Manhattan feel smaller than a prison cell. I remember that night clearly, the rain tapping against the glass walls of my apartment, each drop sliding down like it was trying to escape, just like everyone else who ever got too close to me. I stood there with a glass of whiskey I didn't taste, watching headlights blur into lines below, cars moving, people living, everything continuing without me. I had built something untouchable, something people feared, something people respected, but somewhere along the way I stopped being human inside it. I stopped noticing things, stopped caring, stopped remembering what it felt like to be anything other than in control. And control is a strange thing. It feels powerful until it becomes the only thing you have left, until it replaces every real connection with something colder, something transactional. I told myself that was enough, that it had to be enough, because anything else would have meant admitting I had traded something irreplaceable for it. Something I couldn't buy back no matter how much money I made or how many people answered when I called. And maybe that's why I ended up in that diner. Not because I needed food, not because I was hungry, but because for a brief moment I wanted to sit somewhere that didn't know my name, somewhere that didn't care who I was. The place was small, tucked between a laundromat and a closed hardware store, neon flickering in the window like it was struggling to stay alive. The bell above the door rang when I stepped inside. A simple sound, but it felt louder than it should have, like it was announcing me to a world that wasn't supposed to notice me. And then I saw her. She stood behind the counter with a notepad in her hand, hair pulled back, tired eyes that still held something steady, something real. She looked at me the same way she looked at everyone else, not impressed, not intimidated, just present. And when she walked over, she didn't hesitate, didn't lower her voice, didn't try to read me the way everyone else did. She simply set a cup of coffee in front of me and said, "You look like you need this." And just like that, for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen, and I didn't realize it then. But that moment, that simple sentence, it was the beginning of everything I thought I could never get back. I did not thank her, not right away. I just stared at the cup like it was something unfamiliar, something I had forgotten how to hold. Steam rising in slow curls between us, while the hum of the diner settled into a rhythm that felt almost too simple to be real. A couple in the corner sharing fries, a man in a work jacket scrolling through his phone, the quiet clink of silverware against ceramic. Ordinary sounds that should have meant nothing to me. And yet they did. They filled a space I had ignored for years. She leaned one hand against the counter, waiting, not impatient, not impressed, just there. And that was the first thing that unsettled me. People usually filled silence around me with questions or fear or flattery, but she did not. She let it exist, like it did not need to be fixed, like I did not need to perform. "You always look at coffee like it is going to solve your problems," she said after a moment. Her voice calm, steady, like she had already decided I was not someone worth being nervous about. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. "Does it not?" I asked, my voice lower than usual, less certain, and she smiled, not the kind meant to impress, just a small curve that did not reach for anything more than honesty. "If it did, I would not be working double shifts," she replied. And there it was again, that feeling, something shifting just slightly under the surface, like a crack in something I had kept sealed. I picked up the cup, finally, the warmth settling into my hands, grounding, real. "You do not seem surprised," I said, watching her carefully now, studying the way she moved, the way she did not hesitate. "About what?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "About me," I answered, and she shrugged, like the question itself did not matter. "You walked in, you sat down, you looked tired. That is about it." No recognition, no curiosity about my name, no change in her posture, and for reasons I could not explain, That bothered me more than fear ever had. I was used to being seen as something larger than life, something untouchable. But to her, I was just a man sitting in a booth at nearly midnight. And that stripped something away I had relied on for years, something I did not know how to exist without. You should probably eat something too, she added, sliding a menu toward me without asking if I wanted one. The paper worn at the edges, familiar, real. I glanced at it but did not read a single word. My attention stayed on her. On the way she turned to refill another table's drinks. On the way she listened when someone spoke. Really listened, like their words mattered. It was subtle, easy to miss if you were not paying attention. But I noticed everything. And that was the problem. I had built a life where nothing surprised me anymore. Nothing reached me. But standing there in that quiet diner, watching someone who had every reason to be exhausted still choose to care, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not control, not power, something quieter, something unfamiliar. And when she came back, setting a plate down in front of me without asking if I had decided, I almost told her to take it away, almost retreated back into the version of myself that did not need anything. But instead I stayed. I took a bite. And for the first time in years, I did not think about the next move, the next decision, the next deal. I just existed in that moment. And it terrified me more than anything else ever had. I told myself it was nothing, just a meal, just a place to sit for a few minutes before returning to the version of my life that required no thought and no hesitation. But I did not leave when I finished eating. I stayed, watching the seconds stretch into something unfamiliar, something slower, the clock above the register ticking past midnight, while the city outside kept moving without noticing that I had stopped. She moved through the diner with quiet efficiency, refilling cups, clearing plates, offering small smiles that did not demand anything in return, and every time she passed my table, I felt it again, that strange pull, not desire, not curiosity in the way I understood it, something deeper, something that made me aware of how disconnected I had been for so long. "You are still here," she said eventually, stopping beside the booth with a fresh pot of coffee in her hand, her tone light, but not surprised, like she had already expected it. I glanced at the empty plate in front of me, then back at her. "Is that a problem?" I asked, testing the edges of her reaction, waiting for the shift I was used to, the careful distance, the recognition, but it never came. She simply shook her head and poured more coffee into my cup, the dark liquid steady, controlled. "Only if you are planning to stay until sunrise," she said, "because I am not sure I am paid enough for that." There was humor in her voice, but it was quiet, grounded, not trying to impress, and I found myself almost responding the same way, almost stepping into something normal, something I had not allowed myself to be in years. "What makes you think I do not have anywhere else to be?" I asked instead, leaning back slightly, watching her more carefully now, and she met my gaze without hesitation, without calculation. "People who have somewhere better to be do not sit alone in a place like this at midnight," she said simply. And the words landed heavier than they should have, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. I looked away first, which had not happened in a very long time, my attention drifting to the window where rain still traced slow lines down the glass, distorting the streetlights into something softer, something almost unreal. "You do not know anything about me," I said, my voice quieter now, less certain than I intended, and she did not argue, did not try to prove me wrong. She just wiped down the edge of the table with a clean cloth, her movements calm, deliberate. "No, I do not," she agreed. "But I know what tired looks like." There was no judgment in it, no assumption, just an observation, and for a moment, I considered telling her something real, something honest, the kind of truth I had not spoken out loud in years. But the instinct to protect that part of myself was still there, sharp and immediate. So instead I deflected, like I always did. "And what would you do with that information if you had it?" I asked, and she paused, just for a second, before meeting my eyes again. "Probably the same thing I am doing now," she said. "Make sure you do not leave here worse than you came in." It was such a simple answer, almost insignificant, but it stayed with me longer than it should have, because no one in my world ever thought that way. No one cared about whether someone left better, only whether they left useful or not. I sat there in silence after she walked away, the weight of her words settling into something I could not ignore. And when I finally stood to leave, reaching into my pocket out of habit, she was already there, shaking her head before I could even speak. "You already paid," she said, tapping the receipt on the counter, and I frowned slightly, because I knew I had not. I did not forget things like that. "Then who did?" I asked, and she gave a small shrug, like it did not matter, like it was not worth explaining. "Maybe it is on the house," she said. "Or maybe you looked like you needed one thing tonight that did not come with a price." And for the first time in years, I did not have an answer for that. I just stood there, caught between the life I knew and something I did not understand yet. Something that made leaving feel harder than it should have been. I should have left and forgotten about it. That would have been the logical thing to do, the safe thing. Return to the structure of a life where every moment had a purpose and every interaction had a cost. But instead I stepped out into the rain and found myself standing there longer than necessary. The cold air cutting through the warmth that had followed me out of the diner, the neon sign flickering behind me like it was trying to hold my attention, and I hated that it worked. I hated that something so small, so ordinary, could linger in my mind. Stronger than everything I had built over the past decade. I told myself it was just curiosity, nothing more, just a moment that would fade once I returned to reality. But the truth is I did not go home right away. I drove. No destination, no plan. Just the quiet hum of the engine and the city stretching endlessly in front of me. Lights reflecting off rain-soaked streets. Everything moving in patterns I had once controlled. Patterns that now felt distant, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. I ended up parked 2 blocks away from that diner without realizing how I got there. The engine still running, the clock on the dashboard glowing 12:47 a.m. And I sat there staring through the windshield like there was something I was supposed to understand, something just out of reach. I could have left again, should have left, but I did not. I turned the engine off and listened to the silence settle around me, broken only by the soft patter of rain against the glass. And for the first time in years, I felt uncertain, not about a decision, not about a risk, but about myself, about why I was still there, why walking away felt harder than staying. I eventually stepped out of the car, the rain heavier now, soaking through my jacket as I walked back toward the diner, the bell above the door ringing again when I entered, softer this time, like it recognized me. She looked up from behind the counter, surprise flickering across her face for just a second before it settled into something calmer, something almost knowing. "Forgot something?" she asked, drying her hands on a towel, and I shook my head slowly, because the truth was I did not know what I had come back for, not exactly. "No," I said, my voice quieter than before, less guarded. "I just did not leave yet." And that earned a small smile, the kind that did not ask questions it did not need answered. "That happens sometimes," she replied, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Like people came back for reasons they could not explain all the time. I moved back to the same booth without being told, without asking, and she followed a moment later, setting another cup of coffee in front of me without a word. And this time I did not hesitate. I picked it up immediately, the warmth grounding me again, pulling me into the present in a way I had not felt in years. "You are not from around here," she said after a moment, leaning lightly against the edge of the table, and I raised an eyebrow slightly. "What makes you say that?" I asked, and she shrugged, her gaze steady. "People who belong somewhere do not look at everything like they are passing through." And that hit deeper than anything else she had said, because it was true. I had spent years building a place where I was untouchable, but I had never belonged to it. Not really. I had just occupied it, controlled it, shaped it into something that worked for me, but never something that held me. I set the cup down slowly, the faint sound of ceramic against the table louder than it should have been. "And you," I said, shifting the focus away from myself. "You belong here." And she smiled again, softer this time, almost tired. "For now," she answered, and something about the way she said it made me realize that she was not as simple as she seemed, that there was more beneath the surface, more layers I had not yet seen, and for reasons I could not explain, that mattered to me, more than it should have, more than anything had in a long time. And as I sat there, listening to the quiet rhythm of the diner, watching her move through it like she was part of something real, something steady, I realized that whatever this was, whatever had started the moment she placed that first cup of coffee in front of me, it was not something I could ignore anymore. And that was the first real problem I had. faced in years that I did not know how to solve. I stayed longer than I should have that night. Long enough for the clock above the counter to drift past 1 in the morning, long enough for the city outside to quiet into something softer, something that felt almost disconnected from the life I knew. And the strange part was I did not feel the need to leave anymore. Not immediately. Not like I usually did when something started to feel unfamiliar. Instead, I sat there, letting the silence settle between moments, letting the sound of dishes being stacked and coffee being poured become something steady, something predictable, something I could almost rely on. She moved slower now, the rush of the night fading into the last stretch of her shift, and there was something different in the way she carried herself. Not weaker, not tired in a way that broke her, just human, just real, the kind of tired that came from doing something honest for too long without rest. And I realized I did not know her name. Not yet, which felt unusual. I was used to knowing everything about everyone before I even spoke to them. But with her, I had not asked, had not needed to, and that in itself felt like a shift I did not fully understand. "You ever sleep?" I asked eventually, my voice cutting through the quiet in a way that felt softer than I intended, and she glanced over her shoulder at me, a small smile forming like she had been expecting the question. "Not as much as I should," she answered, grabbing a stack of clean cups and setting them into place. "But rent does not wait just because I am tired." There was no bitterness in her voice, just acceptance, just the kind of reality that did not need to be explained, and I nodded slightly, even though she was not looking at me anymore, because I understood that part more than I wanted to admit, not the struggle, but the cost of maintaining something that never really gave back. "What about you?" she asked a second later, turning back toward me, leaning lightly against the counter. Again, "Do you ever stop?" And I almost laughed at that, almost gave her the answer she probably expected, something distant, something controlled, but instead I hesitated, because the truth was I did not know how to answer that anymore. "I do not remember the last time I did," I said finally, and it was the closest thing to honesty I had given anyone in a long time. She studied me for a moment, not in a way that felt invasive, just thoughtful, like she was trying to understand something without forcing it. "That sounds exhausting," she said quietly, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard, because she was not impressed by it, not intrigued, just concerned in a way that felt unfamiliar. I looked down at my hands, at the way they rested against the edge of the table like they belonged to someone else, someone who had spent years building control but never learned how to let it go. "It is necessary," I replied, more out of habit than belief, and she shook her head slightly. "Maybe," she said, "but necessary does not always mean worth it." And that stayed with me. The way she said it, the way she did not try to convince me, just offered it, like a possibility I had not considered, the kind of thought that lingered long after the words were gone. I leaned back in the booth, exhaling slowly as I watched her move again, the rhythm of the diner wrapping around the moment like it was trying to hold it in place. And for the first time in years, I questioned something I had built my entire life on, not out loud, not in a way anyone could see, but quietly, internally, where it mattered the most. And when she finally walked over to flip the sign on the door from open to closed, the soft click echoing through the empty space, I realized I had stayed through the entire night without noticing the time pass, without checking my phone, without thinking about anything beyond that room. And as she turned back toward me, keys in hand, ready to leave, I felt something unexpected settle in my chest, something that did not belong to the life I knew, something that made the idea of walking away feel like losing something I had just found, even if I did not fully understand what it was yet. She turned off the last light behind the counter, and the diner shifted into something quieter, something almost fragile, like the space itself was exhaling after holding its breath all night. And I realized I had never stayed anywhere long enough to see that moment before, never watched a place close, never paid attention to what remained when everything else left. She grabbed her jacket from the hook by the door, slipping it on with a practiced motion, keys dangling loosely from her fingers, and for a second I thought she would just leave, walk past me like I was any other customer who stayed too long, but she paused, glancing back at me with that same steady look that never tried to be anything more than honest. "You coming, or are you planning to live here now?" she asked, and there was a hint of amusement in her voice that caught me off guard, because no one ever spoke to me like that, not without calculation, not without hesitation, and yet with her it felt natural, like there was no reason not to. I stood slowly, the booth creaking slightly as I stepped out, the sound louder in the quiet space than it should have been. I was not aware that was an option, I replied, and she smiled, shaking her head as she moved toward the door, unlocking it with a soft click. Trust me, you would not like the rent, she said, pushing it open just enough to let the cool night air slip inside, and I followed without thinking, without questioning why leaving with her felt different than leaving alone. The street outside was nearly empty now, the rain reduced to a light mist that clung to the air, streetlights casting long reflections across the pavement, everything softer, quieter, like the city itself was resting. She stepped out first, pulling the door closed behind her and checking it once before turning the key. A small habit, simple, careful, and I noticed it, the way I noticed everything about her without trying. You always walk people out? I asked, more to fill the silence than anything else, and she shrugged, slipping her hands into the pockets of her jacket. Only the ones who look like they forgot how to leave, she said, and I almost responded, almost deflected, but the truth was I had forgotten, at least for a few hours, forgotten where I belonged, forgotten the weight that usually followed me everywhere, and standing there on that quiet street, I did not feel the need to pick it back up right away. What is your name? I asked finally, because it felt strange not knowing something so simple, and she glanced at me, just for a second, before answering. Lily, she said, like it was nothing, like it did not carry any weight, and I repeated it silently, letting it settle, letting it become something real instead of just another detail I could file away. Adrian, I replied after a moment, offering my own name without thinking about it, without calculating whether I should, and she nodded once, like she had expected it, like names were just names and nothing more. Nice to meet you, Adrian, she said, and there was something in the way she said it that felt genuine, uncomplicated, something I had not heard in a long time. We stood there for a moment longer than necessary, neither of us moving, the quiet stretching between us in a way that did not feel awkward, just unfinished, like there was something else that was supposed to happen but had not yet. You should get some rest, she said eventually, breaking the silence. Even people who do not stop need to, at some point. And I nodded slightly, even though I knew I would not sleep. Not yet. Not with everything in my mind shifting in ways I could not control. And you? I said, glancing at her. Do you ever stop? And she smiled again, softer this time, almost distant. Not yet, she answered. And there was something in that response that told me her story was not as simple as it seemed, that there were things she carried too, things she did not show, and for reasons I could not explain, I wanted to understand them, not to use them, not to control them, just to know. And as she turned to walk down the street, disappearing slowly into the quiet glow of the city, I stayed where I was, watching until she was out of sight, because for the first time in years, walking away felt like something I needed to think about, not something I could do automatically. And that was the moment I realized this was no longer just a night. It was something that had already started changing me in ways I did not know how to stop. I did not follow her that night, not in the way I usually would, not with intent or strategy or any need to control the outcome. I just stood there until the quiet swallowed the last trace of her footsteps and the city returned to being what it had always been, distant, indifferent, mine in every way that mattered, and yet suddenly not enough. I eventually got into the car and drove home, but the drive felt different, slower, like I was moving through something instead of past it, and when I stepped back into the penthouse, everything was exactly the same. The glass walls, the silence, the view that stretched for miles, but it did not feel the same anymore. It felt colder, emptier, like something had been removed that I could not name. I set my keys down on the counter and stood there longer than necessary, listening to nothing, noticing how loud the silence actually was, how it pressed in from every direction without relief. And for the first time in years, I did not reach for anything to fill it. Not work, not distractions, not the routines that kept everything in place. I just let it sit. And that was when I realized the problem. It was not the silence that felt wrong. It was everything else, everything that had come before it, everything I had built to avoid moments like this. I walked to the window out of habit, looking down at the streets far below. But instead of seeing patterns and movement and control, I saw distance, separation, a life that existed without me being part of it. And that thought stayed longer than it should have, longer than I was comfortable with. I told myself it would pass, that this was temporary, just a shift in perspective. But the truth is I did not sleep that night. Not even close. I sat on the couch as the hours moved past, the city slowly transitioning from darkness to the pale light of early morning. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, not clearly, not like a memory I could control, just fragments. The way she looked at me without hesitation, the way she spoke like nothing I said held more weight than it should, the way she existed in a world that did not revolve around power or control or expectation. And I could not stop thinking about it, about how easily she stepped into a space I had locked down for years and shifted something without even trying. By the time the sun rose, I had already made a decision, not consciously, not with the kind of precision I usually applied to everything, but instinctively, the kind of decision that forms before you have time to question it. I was going back, not because I needed answers, not because I had a plan, but because something in me refused to let that moment stay isolated, refused to let it be just one night that I could dismiss and move past. I told myself it was curiosity again, that it meant nothing beyond that. But as I changed into a fresh shirt and stepped back out into the city, I knew that was not true. Curiosity fades. This did not. This stayed, steady and persistent, like something that had been waiting for a long time to surface. And when I pulled up to the diner again later that day, the sign in the window glowing faintly against the daylight, I sat in the car for a moment before getting out, something unfamiliar settling in my chest, something that felt dangerously close to anticipation. And I realized then that whatever this was, whatever had started the night before, it was not something I could control the way I controlled everything else. And that was exactly why I walked back inside. The bell above the door sounded different in daylight, sharper, more noticeable, like it was announcing something instead of just marking an entrance. And as I stepped inside, the diner no longer felt like a quiet refuge hidden from the world. It felt exposed, ordinary in a way that made what I had experienced the night before almost unreal. Sunlight filtered through the windows, catching dust in the air, illuminating every detail that had been softened by darkness, the worn edges of the booths, the faint cracks in the tile floor, the steady rhythm of a place that existed whether I noticed it or not. And for a moment I questioned it, questioned whether anything had actually changed or if I had just imagined it. But then I saw her, moving behind the counter with the same quiet focus, the same grounded presence that had unsettled me more than anything else. And just like that, the doubt faded, replaced by something steadier, something that felt too real to ignore. She looked up as I approached, recognition flickering across her face before settling into something familiar, something almost expected. "You came back," she said, not surprised, not questioning, just stating it like it was the natural outcome of something already set in motion. And I nodded once, slower than I intended, because I did not have an explanation that made sense even to me. "It seems I did," I replied, sliding into the same booth without needing direction, without hesitation, and she followed a moment later, setting a menu down in front of me even though we both knew I was not going to read it. "Most people do not return after a night shift," she added, pouring coffee with the same steady motion, the same quiet precision. "They usually forget this place exists," and I watched her for a moment before responding. "I do not forget things that stay with me," I said, and the words felt heavier than I intended, like they carried more truth than I was used to admitting. She paused briefly, just long enough for the moment to register, before continuing like it had not shifted anything. "Then I guess we made an impression," she said, but there was something in her tone that suggested she was not fully convinced. Like she understood that what had happened was not about the place, not really. And I found myself leaning forward slightly, resting my hands against the table in a way that felt more grounded than controlled. "You did," I said simply. And for the first time since I had met her, she hesitated, just a fraction, just enough to reveal that she was not completely unaffected, that something in this interaction mattered more than she was letting on, and that changed something again. Shifted the balance in a way I could not fully explain. The diner filled gradually as the morning crowd started to trickle in, conversations overlapping, plates clinking, the ordinary rhythm returning, but it did not pull me away from the moment, did not break whatever had formed between us. Instead, it framed it, made it stand out more clearly against the background of everything else. "So what is it?" she asked after a while, leaning against the edge of the booth, her voice quieter now, more direct. "Why did you really come back?" And that question lingered, heavier than anything she had asked before, because it did not leave room for deflection, did not allow for the usual answers I relied on. And for a second, I considered giving her one anyway, something simple, something safe. But I did not. I looked at her, really looked, and for once I chose honesty, even if it was incomplete, because I did not like who I was when I left. I said, and the truth of it settled between us in a way that could not be ignored, and she studied me, not with judgment, not with curiosity, but with something quieter, something that felt dangerously close to understanding. And for the first time in a long time, I did not feel the need to hide from that. She did not respond right away, and that silence felt different from the others, heavier but not uncomfortable, like she was choosing her words instead of avoiding them. And I watched the way her fingers rested lightly against the edge of the table, steady, grounded, not restless the way mine had been for years. "Most people do not admit that," she said finally, her voice quiet enough that it did not get lost in the noise around us. And I let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Most people do not notice it," I replied, and that was the truth. I had spent years surrounded by people who saw what I had, not who I was. People who measured value in outcomes and control, not in something as simple and inconvenient as self-reflection. She studied me for a moment longer before nodding slightly, like she accepted that answer without needing to push further, and that in itself felt like something rare, something I was not used to receiving. The morning crowd grew louder, conversations overlapping, orders being called out, the world moving forward without pausing for whatever was happening between us. And yet it did not pull me away. It grounded the moment instead, made it feel more real, more anchored, in something I could not dismiss later. "So what happens now?" she asked after a while, tilting her head slightly, not challenging, not demanding, just asking. And I realized I did not have a prepared answer, not the kind I usually relied on, the kind that turned uncertainty into something manageable. "I do not know," I said, and the honesty of it felt unfamiliar, like I was stepping into something without a map, without control. And instead of rejecting that, she smiled, just slightly, like she understood more than I had said. "That might not be a bad thing," she replied. And for once, I did not disagree. I looked around the diner, at the people coming and going, at the life that existed without permission, without structure, and I realized how far removed I had been from all of it, how long it had been since I allowed myself to simply exist in a moment without calculating its value. And when I looked back at her, I saw it clearly, not just who she was, but what she represented. Something steady, something real, something I had convinced myself I did not need. "You make this look easy," I said quietly, more to myself than to her, and she shook her head almost immediately, a small, knowing gesture. "It is not easy," she said. "It is just worth it." And that stayed with me, settled into something deeper than anything else we had said, because it challenged everything I had built my life around, everything I thought mattered. I reached into my pocket out of instinct, pulling out a few bills and placing them on the table, not because I had to, not because it was expected, but because it felt right in a way I could not fully explain. And she glanced at them before looking back at me, not impressed, not dismissive, just acknowledging the gesture for what it was. "You do not have to keep coming back, you know," she said, her tone softer now, almost careful. And I met her gaze without hesitation this time, without the distance I usually maintained. "I know," I replied, and for a second neither of us looked away, the moment stretching just long enough to say something neither of us voiced, something that did not need words to exist. And as I stood to leave, the familiar weight of my world waiting just outside the door, I realized something had shifted in a way I could not reverse. Not completely. Not anymore. I paused for a moment before stepping away, glancing back at her one last time, and she gave a small nod, like she understood without asking. And as I pushed the door open and stepped back into the city, the noise returning, the movement pulling me forward again, I carried something with me that I had not had in a long time. Not control, not power. Something quieter, something that did not demand anything in return. And as I walked away, I understood it for what it was, not a solution, not a fix, but a beginning. the kind that does not change everything at once, but changes you enough that everything else has to follow.